In the spring of 1941, the pride of Hitler's navy, the battleship Bismarck, roared into the Atlantic. She was more than a warship. She was a floating fortress, armed with guns that could shred anything in her path. Britain trembled as news spread that the Bismarck was loose at sea, hunting convoys and threatening to strangle the lifeline of supplies keeping the island nation alive. Yet, the weapon that would ultimately bring this giant to its knees wasn't except another battleship. It wasn't except heavy artillery, or a fleet of cruisers. It was something smaller, stranger, something once laughed at, dismissed, and even considered impossible. A simple idea from an engineer, considered so outrageous it bordered on illegal within the traditions of naval warfare, would redefine how ships lived and died. It was an idea that many tried to bury, but when it finally came to life, it created the ultimate ship killer. The story of how one man's defiance reshaped the oceans of World War II is not just about machines or battleships sunk in flames. It is a story of human stubbornness, of belief in an idea when everyone else said no. And it begins decades before the Bismarck, in a world that refused to believe ships could ever be slain from the sky. Because to understand how an outdated, slow-moving biplane could disable the most powerful warship afloat, we must first return to the birth of an invention that naval officers called dishonorable, that governments tried to suppress, and that only a handful of dreamers dared to pursue. This is the story of the aerial torpedo, and how an illegal sept idea changed the fate of the seas. At the dawn of the 20th century, the great powers of the world were obsessed with steel giants. Battleships, massive, armored, bristling with guns, became symbols of national pride. To control the seas meant to control empires. And so from Britain to Germany, from Japan to the United States, admirals poured their faith into one thing: bigger ships, bigger guns, heavier armor. Naval doctrine was clear: ships fought ships. To strike a battleship, you needed another battleship. It was a gentleman's ships game, brutal, but bound by traditions stretching back centuries. Anything that threatened to upset this order was met with suspicion or ridicule. But in quiet workshops, a new idea was taking shape: a weapon small enough to be carried by an aircraft, yet deadly enough to pierce a battleship's armor below the waterline: aerial torpedoes. To admirals, it sounded like fantasy, even heresy. Ships were supposed to duel with honor. But the idea that a flimsy aircraft could sink a mighty warship, that was unthinkable. Some even called it illegal, a violation of the unwritten rules of naval war. Still, a handful of engineers pushed forward. In Britain, innovators at the Royal Naval Air Service began sketching designs during the First World War. They imagined an aircraft carrying a torpedo slung beneath it, swooping low over the waves, and releasing the weapon with precision. A single hit could cripple a dreadnought. Men like Commander Charles Rumney Sampson, a pioneer aviator, and Lieutenant Colonel Bradley A. Fisker in America, saw the potential. They were dismissed as dreamers. Naval officers sneered, calling their ideas wild schemes, but the dreamers persisted. By 1915, Britain conducted the first experimental aerial torpedo drops. The idea worked, and suddenly a terrifying possibility was born. The balance of sea power might no longer rest in battleships, but in fragile machines of wood and fabric. The war ended before aerial torpedoes could change history, but their shadow lingered. Between the wars, new navies toyed with the idea: Japan, Britain, Italy, yet funding was scarce. Admirals resisted. Tradition held strong, and so the weapon remained on the margins, underdeveloped, underfunded, almost forgotten. But history has a way of testing forgotten ideas. When Hitler's Bismarck tore into the Atlantic in 1941, Britain needed every weapon it could find. It was then, in desperation, that the aerial torpedo, once ridiculed as impossible, even dishonorable, returned to the stage. And it would be flown not by modern, sleek machines, but by ancient, fragile biplanes, slower than the very ships they hunted. What no one expected was that these relics, armed with an illegal SIP weapon, would change the fate of the seas. They were called the string-bag pilots, young men who flew the fairy Swordfish, a plane so slow, so outdated, that some joked it should belong in a museum, not a war. With its fabric-covered wings and open cockpits, the Swordfish looked more like something from 1918 than 1941. Yet these fragile machines carried a weapon that could change history. And behind the controls were men barely out of their teens. Ordinary men, mechanics, farmers, citizens, students, now entrusted with the task of bringing down the most feared battleship in the world. Dearest Mother, the ship we are hunting is said to be the largest afloat. We are told our aircraft stand no chance. Yet we must try. I cannot help but think of home, and wonder if I shall see it again. To fly a torpedo bomber against a battleship was, in many ways, a death sentence. The pilots had to fly low and straight, offering the enemy's gunners a perfect target. To release their torpedo, they had to approach within 1,000 yards under a storm of anti-aircraft fire. One mistake, one lucky shell, and the plane would vanish into the sea. The men knew the odds. The Bismarck bristled with dozens of anti-aircraft guns. She had already sunk the British battlecruiser Hood, killing over 1,400 sailors in minutes. To face such a monster in a slow biplane required more than courage. It required faith. Faith in their crew, in their fragile aircraft, and in a weapon many still doubted would even work. And yet, they went. Not because they believed they were invincible, but because they knew others would die if they failed. Convoys filled with food and ammunition, Britain's lifeline, their families back home, their entire country, the fate of thousands, perhaps millions, rested on their shoulders. One pilot later wrote, "When the order came, I knew we had no chance of coming back, but someone had to go, and so we went." And so into the storm, into the gunfire, into the jaws of the greatest warship afloat, they flew. On May 24, 1941, the Bismarck made her presence known. Alongside the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, she intercepted a British squadron in the Denmark Strait. Within minutes, disaster struck. Shells from the Bismarck found their mark, igniting the magazine of HMS Hood, Britain's most famous battlecruiser. In a thunderous blast, she vanished, taking 1,415 men to the bottom of the sea. Only 3 survived. News of Hood Sepp's destruction shocked the world. To Britain it was more than a defeat. It was a wound to the nation Sepp's soul. Churchill Sepp's orders were immediate. Sank the Bismarck. Sepp's all costs. The Royal Navy launched one of the greatest hunts in history. Dozens of ships and aircraft scoured the Atlantic, desperate to find the German giant before she reached the safety of occupied France. If Bismarck made port, she would threaten Allied shipping for months, even years. Britain could not allow it. Among those called into action was the aging aircraft carrier Ark Royal and her squadrons of Swordfish. For the young crews, it was time. They had trained for this moment, yet the thought weighed heavy. Could their slow, fragile biplanes really stop the most powerful battleship afloat? The first attack came in brutal weather. Swordfish launched into driving rain, tossed by towering waves. Spotters thought they had located the Bismarck, but in the chaos, the Swordfish attacked the wrong target, the British cruiser Sheffield. Miraculously, no lives were lost. The torpedoes were duds, but the failure underscored a grim reality. Time was running out. By now, the Bismarck was racing toward the French coast. If she reached the air cover of the Luftwaffe, she would be untouchable. For the Swordfish crews, the next strike would be their last chance, and they knew, this time there would be no second attempt. The hunters were closing in. The seas boiled with warships. Above them, fragile biplanes roared into the storm, and on the horizon the shadow of the Bismarck loomed. The loss of HMS Hood reverberated through every ship in the Royal Navy. For the young crews of the Swordfish, the message was clear. If the Bismarck could destroy Britain's Sepp's mightiest ship in minutes, what chance did they have in their cloth and wire biplanes? And the clock was ticking. The Bismarck, though slightly damaged, was making for the French port of Brest. If she reached it, she would be shielded by Luftwaffe squadrons, safe to repair, refuel, and hunt again. The Royal Navy threw everything into the chase, but storms, distance, and confusion worked against them. The great German battleship seemed destined to escape. Admiral John Tovey, leading the pursuit, faced a nightmare. Fuel was running low. Crews were exhausted. He had orders from Churchill himself. Fitted, yet the longer the chase went on, the slimmer the chances became. Every hour brought the enemy closer to safety. For the Swordfish crews, the mood was grim. Their first attack had failed. Their aircraft were obsolete, slow enough that even destroyers could outpace them. And now, they faced the most dangerous run of their lives. To stop the Bismarck, they would have to fly straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and hope their torpedoes did not fail them again. The Bismarck was ready. Her crew was battle-hardened, disciplined and alert. Dozens of guns waited for the inevitable attack. Against such firepower, the odds of survival were razor-thin. Many of the Swordfish pilots knew they would not return. "If we do not make it back, know that I thought of you at the end. Whatever happens, we fly because we must." It was the breaking point. Britain's Seventh Navy was battered, its pride wounded, its ships scattered across the Atlantic. The Bismarck surged toward safety, and yet, in this moment of despair, it fell to a squadron of fragile, outdated biplanes to attempt the impossible. As the sun dipped behind storm clouds on May 26th, the Swordfish took to the air. 13 aircraft, 13 men in the crosshairs of history, and what followed would defy belief. May 26, 1941. The Atlantic boiled with storm clouds and steel. From the decks of HMS Ark Royal, 13 Swordfish biplanes lifted into the fading light. Their target, the Bismarck. Their mission to cripple her, or die trying. The Swordfish flew low, barely above the waves, their engines groaning in the storm. The men inside gripped their controls, eyes fixed ahead, knowing the wall of fire waiting for them. Each one carried a torpedo slung beneath the fuselage, a single chance to wound the beast. Then, the horizon erupted. Tracers filled the sky. Black bursts of flak tore at the air. The Bismarck unleashed her fury, throwing everything she had at the tiny biplanes. To reach their target, the Swordfish had to fly straight and level, offering the gunners a perfect shot. And yet, the Bismarck Sepp's firepower betrayed her. The Swordfish were so slow, so primitive, that her targeting systems struggled to lock on. Shells overshot. Predictive computers designed to track modern aircraft couldn't calculate for biplanes crawling across the sky at barely 100 miles per hour. Still, the pilots pressed on, engines rattling, canvas wings shuddering under the storm of steel. One after another, they released their torpedoes, sleek shadows slicing into the sea, racing toward the German giant. Explosions rocked the Bismarck. A torpedo slammed into her armored belt. Another struck near her stern, shaking the great ship. But it was a single, almost accidental hit that changed everything. A torpedo struck the Bismarck Sepp's rudder. In an instant, the pride of Germany was crippled. Her steering jammed. Her massive engines still roared, but the ship could no longer turn. The Bismarck was trapped, forced into a slow circle across the waves, a wounded beast in the vast Atlantic. Against all odds, the fragile Swordfish had done the impossible. With nothing but canvas wings and courage, they had struck a blow that no battleship could. The great Bismarck was still afloat, still deadly, but she could no longer escape. The hunters were closing in. The hit on the rudder changed everything. Though her engines thundered at full speed, the Bismarck could not steer. She lurched in wide, predictable arcs across the Atlantic. A battleship that once inspired terror was now a wounded animal, unable to escape. For the Royal Navy, the opportunity was clear. Admiral Tovey issued the order, close in and destroy the Bismarck. British battleships and cruisers turned south, converging on the crippled giant. The chase that had nearly slipped away was now tightening like a noose. But the task was not without danger. The Bismarck remained a formidable fortress. Her 8 15-inch guns could still tear a ship apart with a single broadside, and her crew, over 2,000 strong, were determined to fight to the end. The British knew the cost of underestimating her. They had seen the hood vanish in minutes. Now, as they closed in, they prepared for one last brutal fight. Every man knew the next dawn could mean death. The plan was simple in design, deadly in execution. Heavy battleships would engage at dawn, pounding the Bismarck at close range. Cruisers would guard the flanks, cutting off escape, and destroyers, like wolves at night, harried the wounded prey with torpedo runs, keeping her under pressure through the darkness. Through the night, British destroyers attacked, darting in and out of the Bismarck's thunderous guns. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Shells lit the night sky. Though none landed the decisive blow, the relentless assaults wore the German crew down. They were exhausted, battered, and still bleeding from the Swordfish strike that had sealed their fate. On board the Bismarck, morale faltered. The ship could not be saved. The engineers fought desperately to free the jammed rudder, but nothing worked. Captain Ernst Lindemann and Admiral Gunther Lutyens knew what awaited them, the entire Royal Navy bearing down. As the first light of May 27th touched the Atlantic, the trap was complete. The Royal Navy was in position. The Bismarck, once the hunter, was now the hunted, and the final battle was about to begin. At 8:47 a.m. on May 27th, 1941, the guns of HMS Rodney opened fire. The final act had begun. Within minutes, the Atlantic erupted. Rodney and King George V unleashed broadside after broadside, their shells screaming across the waves. The Bismarck answered with her own thunder, her massive guns roaring defiantly, hurling death toward her attackers. But the crippled German battleship could not maneuver. She could not dodge. Every shell that struck her tore deeper wounds. Superstructures collapsed. Turrets were smashed, one after another silenced in flames. From the decks of British ships, sailors watched in awe and horror. They were hammering the most feared warship in the Atlantic, yet she refused to die. The Bismarck fought back, even as her decks burned, even as hundreds of her men lay dead or wounded. For over an hour, the sea was lit with fire. The British closed to point-blank range, less than 3 miles, blasting the German giant with everything they had. Shells ripped through her hull, towers collapsed. Still, the Bismarck fought, a defiant fortress refusing surrender. On board, chaos. Men scrambled to save their ship, to stem the flooding, to fire what guns still worked. Some wept, some prayed, others simply fought in silence, knowing the end was near. At last her guns fell silent. Her decks were ruins. Fires raged unchecked. Yet still she floated, stubborn, unyielding. The Royal Navy unleashed torpedoes to finish the job. One after another struck home, tearing into her side. Slowly the Bismarck began to list. At 10:39 a.m., the great ship rolled onto her side. Men leapt into the freezing water, clinging to wreckage, their cries carried by the wind. The Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, slipped beneath the waves. Out of a crew of over 2,200, fewer than 120 survived. The Atlantic closed over her. The battle was done, and with her sinking, the era of the great battleship was slipping into history. When the thunder of the guns faded, silence fell upon the Atlantic. Only smoke, oil, and scattered debris marked the place where the most powerful battleship in the world had fought and died. Of more than 2,200 men aboard the Bismarck, only 115 were rescued. The rest, nearly 2,000 sailors, engineers, and officers, went down with their ship. Many of them were young men, barely out of their teens. Survivors clung to wreckage, their faces blackened by oil, their eyes wide with shock. British sailors, hardened by war, reached out to save their enemies. They pulled exhausted Germans from the freezing Atlantic, offered blankets, and listened in silence as the survivors wept for their fallen comrades. We watched as our ship turned and sank. Many cried out, many prayed. I will never forget the sound, a sound like the earth itself breaking apart as she went under. Back in London, Winston Churchill addressed Parliament. The sinking of the Bismarck was more than a military victory, it was a restoration of morale. After the dark spring of 1941, when Britain stood alone, the destruction of the German Titan proved that the Royal Navy still ruled the waves. But in Berlin, the loss was devastating. Adolf Hitler was furious. He forbade his fleet from risking major surface engagements. The dream of challenging Britain's Sami had gone to the bottom of the sea with the Bismarck. And yet, the victory was not won by the massive guns of battleships, nor by the heavy armor of dreadnoughts. It was decided by a handful of obsolete biplanes, fragile machines that had no right to succeed. Their daring attack crippled the most powerful ship in the Atlantic. In that moment, the future of naval warfare revealed itself. Aircraft, not armor, would rule the seas. The sea claimed the Bismarck, but her story became legend, a warning, a symbol, and a tragedy written in fire and steel. The story of the Bismarck is often told as a clash of steel and fire, of battleships and torpedoes, of victory and destruction. But at its heart lies something deeper, the courage to imagine the impossible. When one British engineer dared to suggest that fragile canvas-covered biplanes could threaten the might of the German Navy, he was dismissed, laughed at. His idea was called illegal, even absurd. But in war, sometimes the simplest, boldest idea, carried out by men willing to risk everything, can change the course of history. It was not the biggest guns, nor the thickest armor, that doomed the Bismarck. It was persistence. It was ingenuity. It was men flying into storms, against all odds, in machines older than their father's sipped generation, because they believed their mission mattered. Yet we must also remember the men on the other side. Over 2,000 German sailors went to their deaths that morning. They too fought with courage. They too wrote letters home. They too dreamed of life after the war. The ocean became their grave, and with them sank the dreams of a fleet. Today, the Bismarck lies silent beneath 3 miles of water, but her story endures, as a testament to innovation, to the courage of ordinary men, and to the truth that even the mightiest machines are no match for human resolve. This is the legacy of the theological idea sept, that war is not only decided by strength, but by creativity, daring, and sacrifice. The Bismarck is gone, but her echoes remain in the lessons she left behind, and in the men who proved that courage can tip the balance of history. Thank you for watching Echoes of WWII. Until next time, remember the past, so its lessons are never lost.